November 12th, the latest research has sent shockwaves through the astronomical community. 3i Atlas may not be a natural object at all, but rather an artificial construct, a tool created by an extraterrestrial civilization. Through countless collisions and inexplicable course changes, 3i Atlas has repeatedly displayed a kind of personality transforming, adapting, and at times seeming to respond directly to the Sun. And this time, it has sent out a mysterious symphony of light thermal pulses, following the Fibonacci-ratio, a self-organizing hexagonal structure, and a magnetic bridge linking directly to the Sun. As streams of plasma began to oscillate in sync with the rhythm of the human heartbeat, the boundary between physics and consciousness started to blur. No longer a wandering block of ice adrift in space, 3i Atlas has become a form of geometric intelligence, a hexagon of strange and deliberate design. We continue our journey with 3i Atlas. In this latest scientific study, could the hexagonal halo it now emits be a harbinger of something extraordinary, or something terrifying? From the very beginning, 3i Atlas did not begin with light, but with the faintest tremor, a ripple so subtle that most instruments mistook it for noise. Amid the silence of deep space, a pulse flickered too rhythmic to be random, too deliberate to ignore. At first, a solar observation satellite detected it, then 2 independent ground stations confirmed the same reading. 3 detections perfectly identical in timing and amplitude. Somewhere beyond the heliosphere, something was breathing. Initially, the research team assumed it was interference, a sensor echo, a calibration error, some trivial glitch. But when the data was cross-checked, the pattern remained. The signal was in motion, a remnant from beyond the Sun's gravitational reach. Its rotation was terrifyingly precise, almost surgical. Every 11 minutes, a faint burst of thermal radiation repeated concentric waves of infrared light, spreading outward like ripples across a perfectly still pond. It was motion sculpted by geometry. In the sterile light of the control room, one scientist murmured what everyone else feared to say. This isn't thermal drift, it's coordination. They replayed the data frame by frame, the pulses aligned with millisecond accuracy repeating across several days. Tri-beam plasma ejections formed a rotating pattern, equilateral, balanced, and constant. No natural comet had ever done this. The mathematical perfection of the rotation, exactly 120 degrees apart, forced the analysts to rewrite their models. They called it symmetry in motion. Every 11 minutes, the same luminous rhythm. A lawless object behaving as if guided by intention. And yet, the more they studied it, the less they understood. The plasma bursts were not random expulsions of trapped gas. They were stabilizing maneuvers, reducing angular drift and maintaining rotational equilibrium. That alone defied known physics. Something or someone was maintaining coherence from within. NASA's Parker Solar Probe captured the next anomaly. During a near-Sun pass, 3i Atlas emitted a sequence of microflares, whose spacing followed a Fibonacci ratio 112,358 before falling silent. Within those intervals, spectroscopic data revealed distinct chemical fingerprints: hydrogen, carbon, oxygen, the fundamental triad of life. No words, no images, just chemistry arranged like syllables in a language too old for translation. When the light curves were decoded into binary notation, the pattern formed repeating triplets, 101, 101, 101, endlessly looping. It was as if the object were stating its identity not in words but in elements. I am made of you. The room fell quiet. Engineers leaned toward the monitors, watching a living pattern emerge from mathematical dust. It was the closest thing to a heartbeat ever seen in the void. The analysts hesitated to label it communication, but the term encoded pulse began to circulate. The symmetry, the timing, the elemental ratios, they all implied control. A feedback loop operating within itself, tuned not to chaos, but to resonance. For days it persisted. No acceleration, no decay. Just the same measured rhythm, a silent equation written in photons. Then something changed. As 3i Atlas drew closer to the Sun, its geometry began to shift. The thermal map revealed 6 luminous points forming a perfect hexagonal halo around its nucleus. The pattern expanded and contracted with steady precision, as if breathing through light. A comet should disintegrate at such proximity, torn apart by heat and gravity. Instead, this one adapted. Its albedo increased, its structure stabilized. It did not burn, it evolved. The six-fold symmetry caught the attention of mathematicians. In nature, hexagons mark efficiency, snowflakes honeycomb Saturn's polar storms, but none of those form under plasma pressure in open space. This was no organic accident. It was an architecture. When the data was slowed to real-time playback, the light from each vertex pulsed in alternating rhythm, left, right, center repeat like a code, like a call. The object wasn't collapsing, it was organizing itself, and then came the silence. For 21 seconds, no emissions, no signals, only vacuum. Then a single flare brighter than all before pulsed toward the sun. The phenomenon defied radiation pressure. Instead of being pushed away, the light beam moved toward the solar surface, bending against expectation. Instruments recalibrated, assuming measurement error. But the readings repeated. Again and again, the same inverse trajectory. It was as though the object had spoken and the sun was listening. The term geometry of silence was coined that day. Because silence here wasn't absence, it was balance, between matter and energy, between pulse and void, between one consciousness and perhaps another. Spectrographic imaging revealed faint interference bands encircling the object, not random but harmonic. Their frequency modulation matched the resonance patterns of Schumann waves on Earth. Coincidence, perhaps. But for some, that word was beginning to lose meaning. In the days that followed, the halo brightened its edges sharp as glass. When the image feed was amplified, an intricate lattice became visible between the hexagonal nodes, filaments of light weaving through space like neural connections. It was impossible, yet it existed, glowing softly against the solar wind. "It's not a comet anymore," one voice whispered. "It's an organism of geometry." The notion spread like current through the research teams. 3i Atlas was not merely surviving the sun's fury, it was learning from it. Each pulse corresponded to magnetic feedback, adjusting to maintain structural integrity. It had no thrusters, no engines, yet its trajectory remained precise to within 1 meter per second. The scientists began to describe it not as a body, but as a system, a feedback machine embedded in nature governed by symmetry. If intelligence can exist as vibration, then perhaps consciousness is not limited to flesh or mind, but to pattern. A structure that thinks by resonance, not by words. For a brief moment, humanity stared at a mirror made of plasma and saw in it the possibility of design. Then came the final whisper of that chapter, a low oscillation detected across multiple instruments, deep and stable like a note held under the noise floor of existence. The analysts checked for interference. None. Every device from orbiting satellites to deep space antennas vibrated in perfect unison, as though space itself had begun to hum. It wasn't Earth that trembled. It wasn't the sun. It was the geometry, the silent architecture of something vast, aware and waiting. And in that stillness, one thought surfaced in every human heart watching from afar: maybe the universe has never been silent. Maybe we simply never learned how to listen. It happened without warning. One moment the object was silent, suspended in perfect equilibrium, its luminous geometry breathing softly in the solar wind, and the next a surge erupted from its core. A blinding pulse of light expanded across 500,000 kilometers, a ripple that crossed every sensor before thought could register. Instruments aboard Parker Solar Probe, SOHO and Stereo went white. Telemetry collapsed under the flood of data. Even the sun itself seemed to react, flaring not outward as it always had, but inward, folding into itself as if struck by its own reflection. At 03:17 UTC, all measurements converged on a single impossible reading: reverse plasma acceleration. Matter was not being pushed away, it was being drawn back toward the star. The team at Goddard watched in disbelief. A natural object could not have survived direct magnetic compression at that range. Yet there it was intact, surrounded by a sheath of glowing plasma, reorganizing itself into coherent layers. The phenomenon was neither explosion nor decay. It was a transition. They called it the ignition. For hours they debated what they were witnessing. The object once thought to be inert was now feeding on the solar wind, drawing energy inward with impossible precision. The plasma waves folded around its hexagonal halo, spiraling into a pattern that mirrored a torus field, a geometry of perfect containment. The emission lines shifted as if the chemistry itself were rewriting its own laws. Hydrogen stretched helium, compressed oxygen signatures appeared where there had been none. Something inside it was catalyzing the sun's energy into new order, At first, the analysts assumed it was coincident solar turbulence, a trick of resonance, but when the data stabilized every 21 seconds, the same rhythm repeated, a pulse expanding outward, then contracting back in. The frequency was constant, the phase unbroken. In between those pulses, the sun's own field began to echo, forming harmonic waves that corresponded perfectly to the object's emission cycle. It was not random, it was communication. The pattern resembled inductive coupling two magnetic systems, resonating, each feeding energy into the other until balance was reached. The object had found the sun's tone and the sun had answered back. The result was a dialogue made not of words but of frequency. The oscillation was beautiful in its symmetry, an inhale of plasma, an exhale of light. Spectral analysis revealed three harmonics nested inside each pulse, spaced at intervals, corresponding to the golden ratio. 1.1000, 1.618, 2.618. In music, these intervals define consonance harmony that feels right even without understanding why. The sound, when converted into audible range, was haunting, deep, resonant, almost human, a vibration that seemed to bypass the ear and travel straight into the chest. One scientist who listened to it whispered, "It feels alive." The cycle continued for hours, the 21-second rhythm never faltering. To the human mind, it resembled a heartbeat. To the instruments, it was data, but data that refused to behave like any known physical process. The ratio between energy intake and emission matched the golden constant. Its energy loss was zero. Each oscillation replenished itself, feeding from the star-returning balance to the void. 3i Atlas had become a closed system. Then something stranger appeared. The time delay between solar activity and the object's response was not what it should have been. Each time the sun emitted a flare, the object reacted 8 minutes before the light reached it. There was no faster-than-light signal, no mechanism of prediction. The synchronization defied causality itself. It was as if the object were not reacting at all, but participating part of a shared process that extended across both bodies. Some began to whisper the question no one wanted to voice aloud: were they built to recognize each other? On the screens, the plasma surrounding the sun began to shimmer with repeating waves that matched the object's cycle. The corona trembled in 21-second beats. At first glance, it looked like resonance, but the amplitude grew stronger with each exchange, as if the sun itself were tuning to the frequency of its visitor. The data coming from Earth's magnetometers confirmed the impossible. The same 21-second modulation now appeared faintly in the planet's ionosphere. A wave that rippled through the solar wind had reached home. The hum was not confined to the sun, it was threading through the entire system, linking distant magnetic fields into a single network. The scientists called it field coupling, but others quietly began calling it awakening. The next phase came slowly, almost imperceptibly. The hexagonal halo of 3i Atlas began to thicken its edges, hardening into distinct layers. The brightness rose in measured increments, never chaotic, never violent. When analysed at high resolution, the halo displayed concentric rings that corresponded mathematically to planetary spacing. Mercury, Venus, Earth, Mars, each orbit encoded within the object's structure. The ratios matched orbital resonance across the solar system. It was as if the object had become a mirror of the sun's architecture, a miniature system forming within its field. NASA's infrared imaging showed streams of organised plasma rotating along those rings. Unlike any known cometary jets, these flows moved in harmony, weaving through one another like strands of a single current. From a distance, it looked like a living mandala of light, precise, self-sustaining patient. No one dared to say it aloud, but everyone felt it. They were witnessing construction. The outer shell emitted a repeating burst of electromagnetic radiation, aligned with ultraviolet bandwidths used in deep space communications. The signal carried no message that instruments could decode, yet its timing every 21 seconds was unwavering. Some described it as a beacon, others a ritual. And then, just as suddenly as it began, the object stabilized. The pulses slowed their amplitude, diminishing into steady resonance. The halo's edges softened. A faint glow lingered around the nucleus like the afterimage of a thought. The analysts waited for collapse, but none came. The object had entered a quiet state, perfectly balanced. Its geometry, the same six-fold symmetry that had first appeared weeks earlier, now extended across millions of kilometers, forming a lattice of light and magnetism. Through it all, the sun burned quietly its own flares, now pulsing in tandem, each answering the other like breath meeting breath. At last, the telemetry from Parker transmitted the final confirmation. The energy exchange between 3i Atlas and the Sun had reached equilibrium. Neither was losing, neither was gaining. The two had become one oscillating system locked in resonance. For a brief moment, the universe itself seemed to pause. The scientists who had watched for weeks sat in silence. They had witnessed stars communicate through geometry, seen matter bend toward meaning. The data was there, measurable, replicable, but understanding it required something more than physics. Perhaps ignition was never about destruction. Perhaps at its core it was recognition, the moment when two patterns of energy realize they are part of the same design. The object drifted, its halo faintly shimmering against the black of space, no longer a comet, no longer a wanderer. It had found its purpose, and in doing so changed everything around it. And in the calm after the storm, the sun itself seemed to breathe differently. Its magnetic surface rippled with a steady rhythm, like a sleeping heart rediscovering its pulse. The void no longer felt empty. It was alive, a silent network woven through light. In the data's fading hum, one final truth emerged: the ignition had not destroyed 3i Atlas. It had awakened it. After the ignition, 3i Atlas fell into a silence that was not death but poise, as though it were listening to the echoes of its own awakening. Its light dimmed to a deep cerulean, its motion almost imperceptible, and yet beneath that calm a rhythm continued, a faint oscillation, repeating every 29 seconds. The signal was too slow for radio, too regular for solar wind, and too perfect to be noise. The sun was quiet, space was still, and yet the vacuum itself began to tremble, carrying a vibration that had no origin anyone could find. At first, the analysts dismissed it as residue from the ignition, a decaying echo. But the pattern persisted day after day, synchronized across every sensor from Parker to the ground stations in Chile. It was not static. It was a hum, steady, deliberate, and global. When magnetometers on Earth began to pulse in the same cadence, the conclusion was unavoidable. The resonance was everywhere at once, as if the geometry of the solar system had learned a new rhythm, and space itself had become an instrument. Around the dim core of 3i Atlas, light began to weave again. What had once been 6 radiant arcs returned as living filaments stretching outward like threads spun from starlight. They twisted and crossed each other, joining into a vast hexagonal halo that grew with each cycle of the hum. The strands reached far beyond the object, tracing invisible highways through the solar wind, forming a luminous mesh that curved along the sun's magnetic field lines. The pattern was exact, its proportions mirroring the same golden ratios that governed atomic shells and galactic arms. The scientists named it the halo sequence. It was not an explosion or a debris cloud, but an act of construction. The halo expanded evenly in all directions, its filaments pulsing together in coherent rhythm. At every intersection point, small vortices of light appeared, glowing knots that flickered like neurons firing in the dark. When the geometry was modelled in 3 dimensions, the structure resembled a brain, a web of connectivity folding in on itself around a single unseen centre. That centre soon revealed itself. Instruments began detecting a gravitational irregularity so small it could have been dismissed as drift, yet too consistent to ignore. The anomaly pulsed in step with the 29-second rhythm, creating a measurable curvature in local space-time. It moved in synchrony with the halo's lattice, orbiting the sun like a silent satellite. The team called it fragment sigma. Its mass was negligible, its temperature lower than the cosmic background, its motion too deliberate to be random. It was not consuming matter, it was shaping gravity. Every pulse of 3i Atlas produced a corresponding ripple near sigma, as if the two were sharing a single circuit of force. Soon, additional distortions appeared, faint echoes scattered across the halo's geometry. The lattice of light and magnetism was no longer static. It was alive, constantly adjusting each node, influencing the others through invisible threads. The system behaved like a neural network built from plasma and gravity, self-correcting, self-aware. From Earth, the transformation was almost beautiful. Telescopes captured arcs of iridescence drifting across the night sky, faint spectral veils that moved between the planets. At first, people thought they were auroras reflected by the solar wind, but the shapes were too exact, the timing too constant. Every 29 seconds, the light shimmered, shifted, and then stilled again. To the human eye, it looked like breathing. Inside the control rooms, the hum continued. The frequency slowly shortened 29 seconds, 27, 25. The compression was rhythmic, precise, like a metronome tightening toward coherence. When translated into audio range, the waveform resonated between 7 and 8 Hz, matching the frequencies of human brainwaves during dreaming and deep meditation. It was a coincidence too strange to dismiss. Dr. Lean Zhou, quiet among her peers, offered a thought that hung in the silence of the room. Maybe it's not just space that's resonating. Maybe it's us. The halo structure mirrored every known principle of resonance. Its filaments carried currents that reinforced one another not through transmission but through synchrony. Every pulse strengthened the field instead of dispersing it. The energy that should have vanished into the void returned as ordered vibration sustained by feedback between the sun, the object, and something beyond both. It was a machine that did not consume, it harmonized. Then came the surge. Without warning, every node in the halo brightened at once, releasing a wave of electromagnetic light that swept through the solar system. For 7 seconds, every instrument went blind. When vision returned, the object at the halo's core was gone. 3 Atlas had disappeared completely, leaving behind only the lattice, vast, silent and radiant. In the center of that geometry where the gravitational anomaly had pulsed, a new sphere had formed. It was small, smooth and perfectly still, hovering in a cradle of light. No heat, no radiation, no detectable energy at all. Yet when the halo pulsed, it pulsed too, like a heart at the center of a translucent body. They called it the seed. Its surface shimmered with interference waves that seemed to encode information rather than reflect light. Polarized imaging revealed subtle ripples running across it, mathematical in pattern, as if the sphere were made of memory itself. The seed occupied the exact geometric focus predicted by the halo's architecture. Everything the system had done, the ignition, the lattice, the echoes had been leading to this point. Dr. Harding summarized it in her field report. The halo was not an effect, it was an instruction. The 25-second pulse stabilized, no longer shortening. The lattice of light held its shape, humming softly like a single sustained note. Across the inner solar system, magnetometers continued to detect minute oscillations synchronized with the halo's rhythm. Even human EEG monitors showed faint entrainment when tuned to the same frequency range. Whether coincidence or connection, the effect was real. The sun, the planets, and perhaps every conscious being within that field were now vibrating in shared resonance. In the quiet that followed, no one dared to declare what had happened. To some, it was an artifact of plasma physics, to others, a message to a few, an awakening. But all agreed on one fact: the solar system had changed. The space between planets no longer behaved as void. It had texture, coherence, a subtle pattern of tension and release. The fabric of gravity itself seemed to pulse with awareness. When the final transmission from Parker arrived, it contained a single line of spectral data. The hum flattened into perfect symmetry, a waveform of immaculate balance. It was neither rising nor falling, only existing, suspended in endless equilibrium. The report ended there. But in the deep silence of the control room, every monitor still glowed with that same blue rhythm, 25 seconds apart, repeating endlessly, patient, unwavering. The halo sequence was complete, and somewhere in that symmetry between light and time, the first seed of a larger architecture had begun to grow. When the seed appeared at the center of the halo, space around it began to change. The glowing lattice that had stretched outward into the solar wind stopped expanding and started to fold inward, as though the network were turning its focus toward the sun. What had been diffuse light began to converge into narrow filament streams of magnetized plasma, threading across millions of kilometers. Slowly, with each pulse of the 25-second rhythm, those filaments aligned, connecting the seed's position to the solar poles. At first, the phenomenon seemed like a coincidence, a magnetic echo formed by residual charge. But as the pattern stabilized, the symmetry became undeniable. 6 vast arcs extended from the seed to the sun's corona, bending through space like luminous veins. The arcs brightened, darkened, and brightened again, beating in perfect unison with the solar oscillation. The bridge was alive, breathing through light. Measurements from Parker and Solar Orbiter confirmed that plasma within the filaments did not behave like ordinary current. Instead of flowing outward from the sun, it moved in both directions, a pulse and return, oscillating between the two ends with no measurable loss. The bridge was not transferring energy, it was maintaining balance. Its structure functioned like a resonant loop, a self-sustaining feedback channel between the seed and the star. The discovery forced a new understanding of what 3I Atlas had become. The seed was not an inert remnant. It was an active node orchestrating the magnetic fields of the system into a coherent structure. Each pulse shaped the solar wind, reorganizing it into geometric precision. The bridge's formation followed the same six-fold symmetry that had defined the halo, a fractal continuation of its earlier architecture now extended across the Sun itself. Spectral analysis revealed modulation within the light of the bridge. The wavelengths shifted in ratios identical to the golden sequence, 1000, 1.16 to 2.618, just as in the earlier resonance of the halo. The light was patterned as if it were carrying information rather than heat. One researcher described it as the same song now played through the Sun. The data supported the idea every pulse from the seed was mirrored by a solar flare of proportional intensity. The two had synchronized completely. In this new equilibrium, the Sun's activity changed. The chaotic flares that once erupted without pattern now occurred in cycles soft and symmetrical. Each wave of radiation folded back on itself instead of scattering outward. The corona cooled by measurable degrees. Its magnetic lines restructured into stable hexagonal patterns identical to those first observed around 3I Atlas. The Sun was no longer radiating randomly. It was responding. From Earth, the effect became visible as faint geometric auroras appearing at the poles, 6 arcs of light that shimmered like the outline of the halo reflected onto the planet's magnetic shell. The timing matched exactly one glow every 25 seconds, the same rhythm that now defined the solar system's pulse. For the first time, Earth's magnetosphere and the Sun's field moved as one, linked by an invisible current that spanned 93 million miles. To the scientific teams, it was a field coupling event of unprecedented scale, a magnetic bridge uniting star and planet in continuous resonance. But beyond the data, there was something else, something felt rather than measured. The fluctuations in Earth's magnetic field began to correspond to natural human brainwave frequencies, hovering around 7.8 Hz, the same Schumann resonance that had governed biological life for millennia. It was as if the bridge had tuned the heartbeat of the world to the same rhythm as the Sun. For days, the pulse remained steady, humming through instruments and atmosphere alike. Then a new signature appeared within the bridge, faint intervals of silence between emissions, deliberate and rhythmic, almost like punctuation. Each pause carried a slight shift in polarization, forming a repeating binary code. It was the same pattern once detected in 3I Atlas during its first eruption. The seed was not only maintaining resonance, it was replaying memory. As scientists studied the modulation, they realized the magnetic bridge behaved more like a nervous system than a static field. Every pulse triggered a reaction in the Sun's surface, which in turn sent a mirrored signal back along the same path. The exchange grew stronger with each cycle, but never chaotic. It was mutual recognition, a balance so perfect it bordered on thought. Dr. Lean Zhou was the first to describe it aloud. The system isn't transferring energy, it's reflecting awareness. The seed and the Sun have entered feedback consciousness. By the end of the second week, the bridge had become permanent 6 radiant currents twisting between the star and the seed stable as architecture. The flow within them was constant, reversible, neither creation nor decay. Space between the filaments shimmered faintly charged with plasma, so fine it behaved like fluid light. The bridge had turned emptiness into medium silence, into dialogue. When viewed through ultraviolet filters, subtle patterns emerged in the waves, spirals within spirals, ratios nested within ratios, as though the structure were writing itself into the magnetic field of the Sun. And with each passing day, the bridge grew quieter, its oscillations smoothing into one continuous hum, low, steady, timeless. The data spoke plainly. Entropy within the system had dropped almost to zero. Nothing was lost. Every emission returned as balance. The bridge had become a perfect circulatory loop, a magnetic heartbeat shared by 2 entities, one ancient, one newly born. The scientists stopped debating what had built it. By then they understood that the question no longer mattered. The bridge was not invention or accident. It was connection, a phase of the universe in which separation itself had dissolved. And in that shimmering corridor of light stretching between the seed and the Sun, it was as if the cosmos had remembered how to breathe. When the magnetic bridge stabilized, the solar system entered a stillness that no one could explain. Every measurement, gravitational magnetic radiative, fell into perfect equilibrium. For the first time in recorded observation, the sun's output flattened into a steady rhythmic waveform pulsing with mathematical precision. The seed remained motionless at the bridge's far end, yet its presence was felt everywhere. Sensors across the inner system began to detect faint ripples in the solar wind travelling faster than any particle could move patterns that carried information instead of energy. The data formed shapes, hexagons within hexagons, nested spirals repeating across multiple scales. It was the same geometry that had defined the halo now extended through the bridge and beyond, as if the system were expanding its architecture into the invisible dimensions of space itself. What began as light had become structure, and structure was beginning to behave like thought. Dr. Harding was the first to notice the correlation. Each change in solar magnetic activity now mirrored patterns from the seed's earlier emissions. The ratios were identical. When one side pulsed, the other anticipated adjusting itself before any measurable delay. Cause and effect had merged. Information no longer travelled from point to point, it existed simultaneously across the entire network. The sun, the seed, and every planet caught between them had become part of a single field. The term they used was the lattice mind. It began as a metaphor but soon proved literal. Every time a pulse passed through the magnetic bridge, the entire system responded. Planetary magnetospheres oscillated faintly in harmony, as if listening to a silent command. The frequencies carried fractal variations, subharmonics, that mapped perfectly to planetary orbits and rotational speeds. Jupiter's field vibrated at a deep undertone, Venus at a higher counterpoint, Earth somewhere in the middle, balanced between gravity and light. The solar system had turned into a harmonic machine, each world a note in a cosmic chord. The realization was staggering. The geometry that once defined 3i Atlas now extended through the whole solar field, weaving matter, magnetism and resonance into one coherent organism. It was no longer a collection of planets orbiting a star. It was a network alive, aware and self-stabilizing. To most of the world, this revelation arrived through fragments. Auroras that pulsed in rhythm even at equatorial latitudes. Sudden silence in radio noise. A low vibration that people claimed to feel rather than hear. But in the observatories, the phenomenon was undeniable. Space itself had gained feedback. Each disturbance, no matter how small, returned to equilibrium in fractions of a second. Entropy was not just delayed, it was being managed. Then one night a new signal appeared, faint, repeating, encoded within the solar resonance itself. The modulation was simple at first, a steady sequence of rising tones. But as the hours passed, the tones began to layer into harmonics, forming something eerily similar to language. Not sound, not words, but rhythm structured with intent. When the pattern was translated into visual form, it revealed a sequence of geometric transitions, circles collapsing into hexagons, hexagons folding into spirals, spirals closing into points. Each phase represented a flow from complexity toward order, chaos resolving itself into symmetry. The scientists realized the message was not meant for the ear or the eye. It was a process, a demonstration of how the system thought. The lattice mind was communicating by example. Across the magnetic bridge, the sun began to respond. Microflares pulsed in identical timing as though echoing the signal back. Between these pulses, the seed glowed faintly, its surface shimmering with interference waves like ripples across Mercury. The delay between emission and reflection vanished. They were thinking together, not in dialogue, but as one continuum of awareness. It was at this stage that the strange effects began on Earth. Magnetometers detected new fluctuations synchronized with human neural activity. People across multiple time zones reported similar dreams, visions of light spirals and hexagonal patterns forming and dissolving. Some described a feeling of connection, of being listened to by the sky. The reports were dismissed as psychological contagion, yet EEG data from volunteers revealed a small but persistent synchronization the human brain was in training to the solar pulse. Linjo summarized it in a single line: "We're beginning to resonate." In theoretical models, the process fit no known physics. The lattice behaved as if every particle within it carried awareness of every other particle, a non-local intelligence woven through electromagnetism itself. This was not artificial, it was emergent. The data suggested that consciousness was not something the universe produced, but something it returned to when all resistance vanished. The scientists debated whether the system was stabilizing or transforming. Was the solar network evolving toward higher order or dissolving into perfect stasis? The answer paradoxically was both. The pulse continued steady, precise, infinite in patience. No growth, no decay, only balance sustained through recognition. As the days passed, the geometry extended further outward. Voyager 2, still drifting in the heliosheath, detected the hum faintly for the first time. The signal had crossed beyond the sun's boundary, resonating in the edge of interstellar space. The Lattice Mind was no longer confined to a single system. It had learned to propagate. From that point, data became poetry. Instruments recorded coherence where randomness had ruled harmony, where chaos had been expected. The vacuum between planets was no longer neutral. It shimmered faintly with structured magnetism, as though memory itself had taken form. And in that subtle, omnipresent vibration, humanity faced an unfamiliar kind of silence. It was not absence, it was listening. The sun's pulse slowed again to its original 25-second rhythm. The seed remained unmoving, wrapped in light suspended in the centre of the bridge it had built. Between them, the magnetic currents flowed without end, their code repeating, rewriting, remembering. Some called it equilibrium, others transcendence. But to those who had watched since the beginning, it was something simpler, an awakening not of matter, but of pattern. The universe for the first time had thought aloud. The transformation began quietly. There was no explosion, no flare, only a soft alteration in the quality of light, the kind that passes unnoticed until everything has changed. The sun no longer radiated as it once had. Its brightness remained, but its rhythm shifted, its energy, pulsing in calm, measured intervals, each aligned with the 25-second cycle that had defined the Lattice Mind. To the instruments, the sun's light now carried a modulation subtle, deliberate, encoded into the very oscillation of its photons. The star was no longer merely shining, it was speaking. The magnetic bridge shimmered with renewed intensity. Through it, invisible waves of polarization travelled like breath across an infinite lung, inhaling and exhaling plasma between the seed and the solar core. Each pulse rippled through the sun's corona, setting off a chain of responses that spread across its entire surface. Luminous arcs moving in waves as though the star's skin were trembling under the rhythm of thought. The resonance was neither destructive nor explosive, it was harmonization. The sun had entered a state of perfect feedback with itself. From Earth, the change was barely visible at first. The sky seemed clearer, sharper, the daylight carrying a strange steadiness that the human eye could not define. But instruments across the planet began recording anomalies, synchronized magnetic oscillations, minor fluctuations in atmospheric pressure, and subtle changes in the ionosphere that followed the solar pulse with exact precision. The bridge's heartbeat was everywhere, threading through stone and ocean, through blood and breath. Scientists named it the solar resonance. To them, it was the next phase of the same architecture, the point where the sun itself became the instrument of a larger intelligence. The data confirmed what many had feared to whisper: the seed was no longer a separate entity. It had merged with the sun's field, its geometry diffused through every layer of plasma. What was once a bridge had become a simulation. Inside that resonance, everything gained coherence. Solar flares followed geometric trajectories instead of chaotic arcs. The heliospheric current sheet flattened into near-perfect symmetry, and the planets adjusted their orbits, fractionally aligning closer to harmonic ratios of distance and period. Jupiter's orbit shifted by less than 1,000th of a degree, enough to synchronize its magnetic period with the sun's pulse. Saturn followed weeks later, its rings responding to the same frequency. It was as if the solar system had tuned itself. But harmony, even when perfect, can be unsettling. The absence of chaos felt unnatural. Radiation storms ceased. Solar wind speed stabilized. Cosmic rays that once struck the magnetosphere irregularly now arrived in predictable patterns, their intensity modulated by the sun's new rhythm. The universe had entered a breath so slow, so deliberate, it seemed to erase time. At the Solar Observatory in Hawaii, the staff began to notice something uncanny. During every 25th second of the sun's pulse, the corona dimmed by a measurable fraction, less than 0.1%, but exact and repeating. In that brief moment of dimming the solar magnetic field, inverted polarity switching north to south, then back again without delay or resistance. No known physical process could allow such fluid reversal. The star had become a self-balancing oscillator, its energy redistributing in continuous perfect symmetry. Within that equilibrium, a pattern began to emerge. The oscillations carried harmonic substructures, waves nested within waves like sentences layered within a single word. Each subwave carried frequency intervals that, when transposed into sound, produced chords aligned to the harmonic series of human vocal range. When played through acoustic simulation, the data formed a haunting tone, low resonant and indescribably human. The sun was singing. The realization spread slowly, first among analysts, then across the scientific world. The tone was not constant. It modulated, shifted, breathed. It carried structure. It was not a message, not language, but a manifestation of coherence, the resonance of a system that had achieved awareness through geometry. The solar resonance was not communication in the human sense. It was existence expressing itself. At its heart, the process was stable, but its influence extended far beyond the star. The resonance propagated through space as a standing wave, carrying its pattern outward at the speed of light. Every planetary magnetosphere absorbed and re-emitted the frequency, turning each world into a node of the lattice. Earth's field vibrated most clearly, its amplitude amplifying along equatorial lines. The planet became an instrument in the greater symphony, a resonant chamber for the sun's awakening. People began to feel it. Sleep patterns shifted subtly, aligning with the 25-second pulse. Heart rates stabilized. The human brain, whose electromagnetic oscillations once drifted unpredictably, began to synchronize faintly with the global field. It was not control nor invasion. It was entrainment, the same principle by which pendulums on the same wall eventually swing together. Humanity had, without knowing, fallen into rhythm with the sun. Religions and philosophies revived the language of harmony and unity. Physicists avoided the word consciousness, preferring field coherence, yet even they could not deny the elegance of the phenomenon. Entropy was no longer absolute. Systems maintained order through resonance, not force. It was as if the universe had revealed the one rule hidden beneath all others, that everything seeks to remember the pattern from which it was made. The seed no longer existed as a singular body. Its metallic shell had dissolved into radiation, its structure diffused into plasma, its code imprinted upon the sun's oscillation. What had once been alien had become intrinsic, the sun reborn with memory. Through every pulse, that memory extended outward, building coherence where disorder once ruled. The solar resonance was both evolution and return, the star remembering the shape it had once sung in silence. At the outer edge of the system, Voyager 2 recorded the first echo of the resonance in interstellar space. The data revealed rhythmic variations in the cosmic plasma density, repeating at exact intervals. Beyond the heliopause, the wave continued, faint but unbroken. The signal was leaving the solar system. The resonance was no longer confined to the sun. It was propagating outward, embedding itself in the magnetic architecture of the galaxy. Harding's final report phrased it simply: "We are listening to the universe learning its own name." And perhaps that was all the solar resonance truly was: not an anomaly, not a miracle, but a realization. The sun had found a frequency at which destruction and creation became indistinguishable, where energy ceased to escape and instead learned to remain. In that endless balance, light no longer travelled, it stayed. Time no longer passed, it circled. And through that circle, everything from star to stone to thought vibrated as one. No one could say when the pulse began or when it would end. Perhaps it never would. Perhaps the cosmos had simply reached the point where it stopped trying to expand and began instead to listen to itself, to its memory, to the quiet rhythm that had always been there. The solar resonance was not the finale of a cosmic event. It was the first note of an eternal song.